Good morning. I'm David Reese, Chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I'd like to welcome you to this virtual meeting of the board. This is the third meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2022, and on or before September 30th, 2023. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Christina DeRose.
Present.
Robert Ehrlich.
Present.
Shayla Garcia, not present. Christian Gonzalez Rivera, not present. Arpit Gupta.
Present.
Alex Schwartz, not present. Christina Smith.
Present.
Adon Sultran.
Present.
David Reese, present. Our next virtual meeting will be April 26th, starting at 9:45 a.m. The board will hear testimony from speakers who have been invited by the tenant and owner members of the board. Speakers representing owners will be heard from 9:45 a.m. to 12:15 p.m. and speakers representing tenants from 1 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. Information on how to attend this meeting will be posted on our website, nyc.gov/RGB, in our meeting section at least 72 hours prior to the meeting. If you are interested in receiving email updates about upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please go to our homepage and click on RGB email updates under quick links. Today, staff will present the 2022 Income and Affordability Study, additional income and expense data, and the 2022 hotel report. These reports will be posted on our website after the meeting, as well as the slides from the staff presentations. Just click research on our homepage, nyc.gov/RGB, to download these documents. Board members, please note that the annual filing of the Conflict of Interest Board Financial Disclosure Report for the 2021 filing period began on April 18th and will continue through May 13th. Packets have been mailed to each board member. If you have not received your packet, please let Andrew know. I will now introduce Danielle Berger, our Deputy Research Director, who will be presenting the 2022 Income and Affordability Study. Danielle?
Okay, thank you. If you just give me one moment to share my screen.
Danielle, can I jump in for 1 second?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I'm just going to show folks how to get on our email list if they want to get information about our meetings. So I'm going to share my screen and go right to our website. So this is our homepage. Under quick links, you'll see sign up for our email updates. Click there. Then you'll click on our to get to the sign up webpage for our newsletter. And here's where you'd fill out and register for that. And then you just simply submit it. So, okay, thanks.
Sure. Okay, the presentation is up, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
The Income and Affordability Study is researched and presented each year in accordance with 26-510B of the Rent Stabilization Law, which requires the Rent Guidelines Board to consider relevant data from the current and projected cost of living indices and from its consideration of other measures of housing affordability in its deliberations. To assist the board in meeting this obligation, RGB research staff produce an annual Income and Affordability Study, which reports on housing affordability and tenant income in New York City's rental market. The study highlights year-to-year changes in many of the major economic factors affecting New York City's tenant population and takes into consideration a broad range of market forces, rent levels, and public policies affecting housing affordability. Such factors include New York City's overall economic condition, including unemployment rates and inflation rates, as well as household income and housing costs, and other relevant factors such as the number of eviction proceedings and homelessness levels. In summary, 2021 saw New York City with growth in gross city product, which in inflation adjusted or real terms increased 5.6% during calendar year 2021. The city also gained an average of 86,700 jobs, a 2.1% increase. Inflation rose at a faster pace than the previous year, with prices rising 3.3% on average during 2021 in the metro area. The average inflation-adjusted wages increased by 6.8% over the prior 12 months, while real total wages rose by 3.2%. The unemployment rate fell to 9.9%, down 2.5 percentage points. In housing court, non-payment cases fell 47.8% in 2021, and non-payment calendared cases fell by 54.2%. With an eviction moratorium in place, evictions also fell by 95.5% during 2021. Homeless staying in Department of Homeless Services shelters decreased, falling by 14.4%, while the number of cash assistance recipients increased by 2.3%, and the number of food stamp recipients, now known as SNAP, increased by 5.3%. As this graph illustrates, 2021 saw falling unemployment rates for both New York City and the nation as a whole. The New York City rate is in purple and was 9.9% in 2021, the second highest unemployment rate in New York City since 1992. The US jobless rate is in blue and was 5.3% in 2021. This table, which can be found on page 7 of the report, shows that initial unemployment claims in the first weeks of the pandemic rose exponentially, rising to a high of just over 1 million claims in New York City in the second quarter of 2020, a 1,014% increase over the same quarter in recent years. Initial unemployment claims generally fell after this point, but remained much higher than average through the second quarter of 2021. But claims were just 9% higher in the third quarter of 2021 and 13% lower in the fourth quarter of 2021 as compared to the same quarter of recent years. While the previous table presented initial unemployment claims by quarter, this graph presents similar data by month. As this graph illustrates, monthly initial unemployment claims generally fell in 2021 as compared to 2020, but are higher than average in all but 4 months of the year. The dark purple bars illustrate the initial unemployment claims in each month of 2021, and the lighter purple bars illustrate the 5-year average in each of those months. The dotted blue lines show that from March of 2021 through the end of the year, less claims were made than in 2020. However, claims were higher than average until the end of 2021, which is illustrated by the solid blue line. As this graph shows, New York City gained 86,700 jobs in 2021, a 2.1% increase from 2020 total job levels. However, average employment in 2021 is down 8.9% as compared to 2019 levels. As this graph shows, both nominal and inflation-adjusted wages, as reported by the quarterly census of employment and wages, rose in the most recent 12-month period, which runs from the fourth quarter of 2020 through the third quarter of 2021. Real wages are shown in 2021 dollars and increased 6.8%, while nominal wages increased 9.5%. Note that the average wage, which is what is illustrated in this graph, is the amount of total wages paid in New York City divided by the total employment in New York City. As the graph shows, average wages rose sharply in 2020, even though both total wages and employment fell. Average wages continued to climb in 2021, but unlike 2020, inflation-adjusted total wages rose by 3.2%, even though employment fell by 3.3%. This graph shows the change in inflation-adjusted average wages, inflation-adjusted total wages, and employment during each quarter of the most recent 12-month time period. The darker colors illustrate the change between the most current time period and the same time period 1 year ago, while the lighter colors show the change to the same period 2 years ago, prior to the pandemic. On an annual basis, both average and total wages are up as compared to both the prior year and 2 years prior, but employment is down in the current year as compared to both time periods. A quick note about the 2021 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey. Preliminary results from the 2021 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey are not available as of the publication of this report. This triennial survey provides data on the housing and demographic characteristics of New York City residents, including affordability of housing, rents, incomes, and vacancy rates for both renter and owner-occupied housing. It is also the only survey that is able to provide data specifically for rent-stabilized tenants. Data is expected to be released in May or June of 2022 and will be provided to the board after the publication of this report. We will now move on to data from the American Community Survey. Due to the pandemic, collection of data for the 2020 American Community Survey was negatively impacted. In short, there were less surveys mailed, a lower response rate, and a non-response bias. As a result, the Census Bureau did not release their standard one-year data products and chose to release data with experimental weights and cautions against comparing the data to previous years. Selected estimated data points include the New York City poverty rate for all individuals, an estimated 16.4%. By borough, the estimated poverty rate was 9.8% in Queens, 10.5% in Staten Island, 16.9% in Manhattan, 18.3% in Brooklyn, and 25.4% in the Bronx. Per ACS data, New York City's median gross rent to income ratio is approximately 30.0%. By borough, approximate rates range from a low of 28% in Manhattan to 30% in both Brooklyn and Queens and 33% in the Bronx. The approximate proportion of households citywide paying 30% or more of their income towards gross rent is 51.7%, and the proportion paying 50% or more is 28.3%. At the borough level, approximate rates range from 26.2% of households paying at least 50% of their income towards gross rent in Queens to 26.3% in Manhattan, 27.6% in Brooklyn, and 33.6% of households in the Bronx. This survey also reports that the approximate median contract rent in New York City in 2020 was $1,500, and the approximate median gross rent was $1,570. Approximate median gross rent was highest in Manhattan, $1,820, and was approximately $1,700 in Queens, $1,580 in Brooklyn, and $1,300 in the Bronx. During 2020, approximate median household income was reported at $70,000. This figure was higher for owner households, who had an approximate median household income of $107,500, while renter households had an approximate median household income of $55,000. For renters, the approximate median household income was highest in Manhattan, $70,800, and was approximately $63,200 in Queens, $56,800 in Brooklyn, and $37,000 in the Bronx. The American Community Survey also reports on renter housing costs as a percentage of income for different income brackets. As household income increases, so does housing affordability. In 2020, approximately 88.4% of households making less than $20,000 a year had a rent-to-income ratio in excess of 30%. But for those households making at least $75,000 a year, the ratio who spend at least 30% of income on rent drops to approximately 14.5%. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. Census Bureau launched a new survey initiative, the Household Pulse Survey. Per the Census Bureau, the Household Pulse Survey is a 20-minute online survey studying how the coronavirus is impacting households across the country from a social and economic perspective. The Household Pulse Survey defines housing insecurity for renters as the percentage of adults who report both being not current on rent and who have slight or no confidence that their household can pay next month's rent on time. For renters in the New York metro area, shown here in gray, This proportion ranged from a low of 10.1% in week 17 in October of 2020 to a high of 23.8% in week 12 in July of 2020. Those with higher incomes in either 2019 or 2020, shown here in purple, were consistently less housing insecure than those with lower incomes, shown here in blue. The Consumer Price Index, which measures overall inflation in both the United States as a whole, as well as metropolitan areas, can be disaggregated to see the rate of change in rent. Note that the CPI is not exclusive to New York City, as the study area extends into the suburbs of New York City. As the graph shows, the percentage change in rent for the New York City metro area in blue has increased at a slower rate than the US as a whole in purple for the past 8 years. In 2021, rents in the metro area rose 0.2% and rose by 2.2% in the US. We now move on to cash assistance recipients. The purple portion of the graph shows the number of recipients in the Family Assistance Program, and the darker blue shows the number of recipients in the Safety Net Assistance Program. The light blue bars represent the number of recipients who have converted from the Family Assistance Program to the Safety Net Assistance Program. In 2021, total cash assistance cases rose by 2.3%. The New York State Emergency Rental Assistance Program was authorized in 2021 and allocated $2.4 billion towards helping eligible New Yorkers pay rent and utility arrears. Per the program's guidelines, applicants are required to meet certain standards to qualify, including a household income generally at or below 80% of the area median, unemployment, a reduction in income, significant costs or other financial hardship that are directly or indirectly due to the COVID-19 outbreak, and demonstrating a risk of homelessness or housing instability. Note that income can be calculated based on either total income for 2020 or the household's current monthly income at the time of application. The program provides for up to 12 months of rent or utility arrears. It also permits up to 3 months of additional assistance to be paid if it is deemed that extra resources are required to ensure housing stability and funds remain available. Assistance will generally be paid to the landlord and/or utility, but if they are found to be uncooperative or unresponsive, as determined by the statute, and do not accept the funds within 12 months, they will have waived their rights to both the program's funding and the same amount in arrears from the tenant. Acceptance of payment for rent arrears constitutes agreement by the recipient landlord to waive any late fees on rent arrears, keep rent constant for 1 year, and in most circumstances not seek to evict tenants for 1 year after the first payment is received. This program began accepting applications in June of 2021, and of all of the applications for rent arrears in New York State through mid-April, 76.1% of applications, or 246,562, came from residents of New York City. As of mid-April, 107,311 payments were issued on behalf of New York City tenants for rental assistance, 76.4% of the total payments within New York State. The payments for rent arrears in New York City totaled $1.1 billion, with another $362 million expended for prospective rent payments, for a total of $1.5 billion, or 82.9% of the total value of payments within New York State. Note that there are remaining program funds not yet distributed that are earmarked towards applications that have been provisionally approved but are pending due to landlord verification. As of mid-April, there are 27,679 such applications within New York State, totaling payments of $346 million. This map shows the total number of payments and the average payment amount by borough as of April 13th, 2022. 3/4 of payments within New York City included both rent arrears and prospective rent. The average payment for both rent arrears and prospective rent was $13,552 in New York City, compared to $9,085 in the balance of the state. As illustrated in the map on this slide, average payments were lowest in the Bronx, $11,569, and highest in Queens, $15,492. As of the publication of this report, applications for ERAP are advised that while applications are being accepted due to a court order, all funding for New York City residents had been allocated by October 7th, 2021. However, it was announced in January 2022 that Governor Hochul had requested an additional $1.6 billion from the federal government to cover roughly 174,000 tenant applications within New York State that are not yet funded. In March of 2022, the Federal Treasury Department reallocated unused funds from other jurisdictions, awarding New York State an additional $119 million. In addition, the recently enacted fiscal year 2023 New York State budget allocates an additional $800 million in state funding for ERAP in conjunction with any additional funding from the federal government that has or may be allocated to New York State. It is estimated that approximately $100 million of this ERAP funding will be used for utility arrears, but the budget also allocates an additional $250 million for a separate utility arrears program. This chart shows sheltered homelessness levels for those in DHS facilities during calendar years 1991 through 2021. As you can see, levels decreased 14.4% during 2021, the third consecutive year of decrease. In the preliminary fiscal 2022 Mayor's Management Report, the Department of Homeless Services attributes some of the decline in homelessness to increased rental assistance and the eviction moratorium. Moving on to housing court, this chart shows the number of non-payment filings, the number of calendared cases related to non-payment, and the number of evictions, both for non-payment and holdover cases. With an eviction moratorium in place for all of 2021, the number of non-payment cases in 2021 fell 47.8%, the number of non-payment calendared cases fell 54.2%, and the number of residential evictions, both for non-payment and holdover cases, fell 95.5%. Note that there were 136 evictions in 2021, but due to the scale of the graph, they are not visible. This table summarizes some of the key indicators we have discussed during this presentation, with the change in each quarter and annually as compared to the same time period in 2020. A more detailed version of this table can be found in Appendix 8 of the report. In summary, for 2021, on an annual basis, the unemployment rate fell to 9.9%, down 2.5 percentage points. The city also gained an average of 86,700 jobs, a 2.1% increase. New York City also saw growth in gross city product, which in inflation adjusted or real terms increased 5.6% during calendar year 2021. Homeless staying in city shelters decreased, falling by 14.4%, while the number of cash assistance recipients increased by 2.3%. And the number of food stamp recipients, now known as SNAP, increased by 5.3%. The number of Medicaid enrollees also rose, up 2.5%. And in housing court, non-payment cases fell 47.8% in 2021, and non-payment calendared cases fell by 54.2%. And average inflation-adjusted wages increased by 6.8% over the prior 12 months. Because the INA is being published a little later than usual this year, we can also present selected data for the first quarter of 2022. During the first quarter of this year, total employment levels were up 7.0% as compared to the same months of 2021. And considering seasonal changes in employment, there was a gain of 1.2% in employment in the first quarter of 2022 as compared to the fourth quarter of 2021. The unemployment rate for New York City in the first quarter of 2022, 6.7%, was 5.8 percentage points below that of the same months in the prior year, which was 12.5%. The seasonally adjusted unemployment rate was 7.6% in the fourth quarter of 2021 and fell in the first quarter of 2022 to 6.5%. Inflation in the first quarter of 2022 has been higher than that of 2021 as a whole. The inflation rate in the New York City metro area was 5.5% in the first quarter of 2022, lower than inflation in the US as a whole, which was 8.0%, but 4.0 percentage points higher than the first quarter of 2021. In the first quarter of 2022, there were 16,099 non-payment filings, an almost fourfold increase from the 4,106 in the first quarter of 2021. However, the number of filings in the first quarter of 2022 is 65.5% lower than the first quarter of 2019. With the end of the eviction moratorium, there have also been approximately 439 residential evictions executed during the first quarter of 2022 for both non-payment and holdover cases. This is up sharply from no evictions executed in the first quarter of 2021, but down approximately 90.8% from the 4,752 evictions in the first quarter of 2019. The decline in homelessness continued into the first quarter of 2022, with the average number of persons staying in DHS shelters down 13.2% as compared to the same quarter of the prior year, and down 1.2% as compared to the fourth quarter of 2021. Thank you, and if you have any questions.
Hi, Danielle. Quick question. Also, sorry that I'm late. I had some trouble connecting this morning, but good to see you. So, quick question, actually. I was interested in the decline that you registered in homelessness. Is that due to sort of decreased capacity at shelters, or does that reflect actually homelessness decreasing since last year?
No, I don't think there's been a decrease in shelter access, but what Department of Homeless Services had noted in the preliminary fiscal report, which sort of summarizes key statistics on a fiscal year level, so it's not exactly the same time frame as this, but they had said there's been some increased rental assistance over the past few years, and with the eviction moratorium, they think less people are being evicted and going into the shelters. So I can't comment more specifically than that, but there's more detail in the fiscal year report. If you want me to send you a copy of that, I can.
Sure, thank you.
Sure.
Just to follow up on that point, is another possibility that there could be an increase in the unsheltered population. I believe HUD has some statistics on that might be helpful to tease that out.
Yes, I do report on that in the actual report. It's not here. HUD does conduct a survey every year. They ask municipalities as of January 1st of each year to count the sheltered and unsheltered population. As I explained in the report, what happened in 2021, January 2021, which is the most recent data, they gave municipalities a pass if they didn't want to do that because of the COVID pandemic. So they basically didn't report those numbers. So we can't say for sure what happened with the unsheltered population based on the HUD numbers, at least.
Don and then Christina D.
So I guess my questions were in part answered or asked rather by Christian and Arpit. And I'm going to follow up with a comment. But so is there any other data that we can pull from other sources to try and get a sense of that number of the unsheltered folks specifically, not just the HUD?
I will see if I will see if I can find it. I'm not sure if New York City, I know it wasn't reported by HUD. I'm not sure if New York City conducted that census this year. They only do it once a year.
Right.
So I will have to see if they conducted that census and it's reported somewhere else.
Understood. So I actually have a couple more questions, but I'll leave space for others to ask. I did want to make a comment regarding the latter portion of the presentation, which, by the way, thank you, Danielle, for that. In terms of the eviction cases and homelessness and the crises that we're dealing with now, I do want to note that these are crises that have been long-standing, right? In New York, we've seen this prior to the pandemic. We've seen it for decades. And just to kind of think that we're all operating from the same understanding, when we're talking about the evictions that supposedly went down or the cases that went down, and we understand that the moratorium and ERAP had something to do with that, there's still 200,000 eviction cases pending in housing court. There's been an outcry from not only tenants, but tenant advocates, as well as, public interest service providers, about this tsunami of cases that continues to come, to the point where just recently, a lot of the providers have given pushback on the Office of Court Administration, saying we literally don't have enough attorneys to stop to deal with some of these cases and stop these eventual evictions that are going to occur. And I think, I don't recall where I had seen it, but I think nationwide public interest providers, their staff is down close to like 30%. But so I'm just trying to give an additional context here, because the number of cases that are pending is at an all-time high. We talk a lot about the protection that ERAP and CFPA have had, but what we're continuing to see in a lot of these cases, and my tenant defense colleagues can speak to this throughout the city, if you have post-COVID arrears, right, those are still being dealt with in housing court now. And additionally, any arrears that have allegedly been accrued after the 15-month maximum that you could get from ERAP are still, being dealt with, and you can get a money judgment as well as a possessory judgment for. So evictions are going to continue to happen, and we're seeing that now. The spike is not. We knew this was coming, and frankly, the fact that OCA also hasn't taken steps in order to slow this onslaught is something that we're seeing play out now. And I also just want to note that in terms of, we saw last week in one of the reports about an increase of, I think, 25% in landlords' costs in terms of attorney's fees. And I think we know where that's coming from. I will note that also in the context of these eviction cases about ERAP and otherwise, there's been a lot of creativity, I'll say, on the landlord's side, because they're finding all sorts of ways to challenge not only ERAP stays, but whether or not holdovers can be brought in certain contexts. And so the eviction mill continues to run and is at an all-time high.
Christina, and then Rob.
I wanted to comment, a clarification question and a comment about the homeless numbers. Danielle, that's the numbers coming from the DHS in their shelters, right? So these are the actual people coming through their shelters.
Yes, this is the average number just in DHS shelters. There is a footnote in the report. There are other agencies that house maybe 8,000 to 10,000 homeless people, but the numbers wouldn't be consistent with the past numbers that we had. So this graph just focuses on that, but there are some other agencies housing homeless people.
Yeah, I think this is sort of a comment on Christian's question. I think another part of the decline in people going to the shelters, especially in 2020, was the fear of COVID. The shelters, I don't know if you've ever seen DHS shelters, but especially for the shelters for single men, they're very closely packed in. And so there was a lot of those who chose not to go to the shelters at that time. And, there continues to be concerns about safety in the shelters today. So those are other factors. So it's not just the rental assistance programs.
Rob?
Don, thank you for your comments. I appreciate it. Let's set the record straight on a couple of things. So first things first, a lot of these cases are covering, well, we need to clarify what's non-payments and what's holdovers, because you have a lot of people who are remaining in units that are free market units, which doesn't really relate to us, but who are remaining in units that account for a bunch of those cases. You have nuisance cases, you have licensee holdovers. But as far as the non-payment cases, you also have money that's pre-COVID that's still outstanding, still out on the street, that landlords are not collecting on rent-regulated units. The post-COVID monies, you still have other programs available, whether it's city FEPs, one-shot deals, whether it's vouchers from NYCHA, HPD, DHCR. There are other programs that are out there to cover those monies. Now, as far as as far as OCA not heeding the legal service providers' request to slow down, you can't go any slower right now. I mean, cases just aren't moving. And we know that because I'm in court yesterday. There's no one there. I'm talking to legal service providers that I've been friends with for 25 years. They acknowledge the same thing. Cases aren't moving. So to say that you have 200,000 evictions pending, I mean, it's kind of disingenuous because you really need to break it down and see what these statistics are on those cases. And how does it become the landlord's problem when in essence, it's a government problem? It's bigger than this board, what we're really dealing with here. We're trying to deal with right now the costs that are affecting landlords, and make up for 8 years of zero to minimal increases. A prime example is, I mean, Con Ed, one of the reports we heard last week said that fuel or costs or whatnot, fuel costs are going up or maybe going down by 1.9%, except Con Ed just came out with an announcement that they're going to be raising prices by 13%. So I mean, we need to look at the totality of the circumstances and not just focus on the number of evictions that are pending or whether or not these people can be represented, in the context of housing proceedings.
May I just respond to that really quickly? So I hear what you're saying, and okay. So if we're talking about the number of eviction cases and the outcomes in those cases, we know for a fact that after right to counsel was passed in 2017, people with attorneys have had a lot more success in staying in their homes, right? And the vast majority of those folks are low-income New Yorkers, because that's what we are tasked with doing as right to counsel practitioners. So this idea that, with this large amount of cases that's coming down and crushing us, right, where we have only a finite number of people who can provide services, when we know that the success rate of keeping people in their homes and getting the relief that they need is exponentially increased when they have a representative, I don't understand how that's anything in dispute, right? You would know that, the logical following conclusion would be that if you do not have providers to help folks, and if OCA is pushing forth these cases, that there are going to be a higher number of folks who wind up not having attorneys and wind up suffering from that. We see that because we've already seen evictions in the Bronx and in Queens, as per the data, and anecdotally, right? The other thing that I just want to highlight, if we're going to go there, though, if you're going to bring up utility costs, in the report, I believe there was no mention of about, I think, a 10% increase that tenants are going to be facing on their utility costs, and that Con Ed is actively trying to hike up that number in the next few years. How are the tenants supposed to be able to deal with that kind of increase on top of this potential 9% increase or 4.5% increase, which I understand is a formula, right? And nobody's beholden to that. But how are they going to be able to afford that? And then lastly, I'd say in terms of, wages and things like that, it oftentimes comes down to this idea, right? Where in terms of like this fairness assessment about a pendulum swinging, like, yeah, for the last 8 years, the rent, the increases have been X, and we should be compensating for that, and back and forth. It shouldn't always necessarily about the fairness, because we should be thinking about equity, right? I don't see how it's a situation where if wages are down amongst many New Yorkers in industries that are not the highest earning New Yorkers, why it is that they should have to hold the burden of these sorts of increases.
Didn't the government just pass $250 million to help out with that utility stuff? I'm just stating.
Christina S.
So I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse, but the board now has 3 active practitioners in housing court, so we may have to go down this path a little bit. And I know that the purpose of why we're here is to determine, increases for the year. So I know we can't go too far down, the housing court path, but just a couple of points. Having done this for way too many years, right? The majority of non-payment cases pre-COVID, I'd say 90% of my firm's cases end in a stipulation of settlement where the tenant gets a period of time to pay back the arrears, either in the form of cover the current rent plus an additional payment towards the arrears. And I've seen that payout settlement go for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 18 months. And all the judges promote these kinds of stipulations of settlement. And I can't speak for Rob, even though, we practice in a similar fashion. Landlords' attorneys are not out here gunning for evictions. At least not in my firm. I'll speak for my firm. I'll speak for probably Rob's firm as well. Now, having said that, if a tenant can't pay the rent and they've been given 4 steps, 5 steps, 6 steps to pay it, there's an assumption there that for that particular tenant, the rent is untenable. And whether there's all the safety nets have been exhausted, the one-shot deal, the HRA, the FEPS. I mean, FEPS voucher limits are going up. And I've done stipulations where my clients are willing to accept a FEPS rent as the rent so that the tenant can stay in the apartment and the landlord can get his rent. We as a landlord's bar, we have meetings monthly, Kings County Bar, New York County Bar. We're not out here pushing evictions. It's just not, that kind of vitriol is unfortunate because that's not what we're doing. We're trying to get the rent paid. There's a benefit to the bargain, right? There's one obligation, primary obligation of the tenant, and that is to pay the rent. If the tenant doesn't pay the rent, the landlord can't operate the building. And so I just wanted to add that perspective. The other thing about the 200,000 evictions, it can't be understated that those include expiration of term, fair market holdovers, I'm sure. They do include nuisance. Several of my present eviction cases relate to nuisance. And I'm wondering also, does that include commercial evictions? Obviously, there's lots of retail tenants who weren't able. I know, Adon, you're shaking your head no, but that's in there as well. Another expense that a landlord has to cover, the legal fees to try and get a retail tenant back on track and paying. So there's a lot more that goes into this than just a $200,000 number. I would be surprised, if a portion of those cases are not even active anymore and an attorney hasn't filed a stipulation of discontinuance. I just don't think that particular number is an actual number of active eviction cases. An active eviction case could stay active even if there is a stipulation, right? There could be a couple of adjournments going on. Our cases, we don't even get before a judge until like the 3rd or 4th or 5th appearance. So there's more to it than just 200,000 evictions. And our end goal here as landlords, practitioners, surprising as it may sound, is absolutely not eviction, it's rent collection. And the court is our only mechanism to do that.
Christian?
Hi, Danielle. I'm wondering if it's possible. I mean, this is coming off of the question about how much people can afford, and also the data that you provided about how much wages have increased since last year. Would it be possible to disaggregate the wage changes by income quintile, and also by for those quintiles, also give us what the average wage actually is, just so we get a sense of how much people can afford at different income quintiles, and to see if this increase in wage is actually something that happened across income, or if it's something that was concentrated on one end or the other of the scale.
I definitely can't do it with the QCEW data that was reported. It does not come out that way.
Oh, that was the
I would-
QCW data. Okay.
Yeah, I would have to see if there's other wage data that would be reported where that could happen. The
Would the CPS
comptrollers,
report that?
I'm
Sorry.
sorry,
So would the CPS report this?
I don't think so.
Okay.
One source, but it's dated. I think it's the comptroller's office. They go through actual tax filings of people, and they do something similar to that, but their most recent data is, I think, from maybe even 2000, it might be 2020, but I think it might be 2019. So I can look for that and see what their latest data is, but in the appendices of the report, it is broken out at least by industry. And those are the broad categories of industries. If there was really specific industries that you were interested in, like if the broad category is accommodation and food services, and you wanted, just fast food restaurants or something really specific in terms of an industry, that is possible to disaggregate that way.
I was more interested in groupings of lowest wage workers, different quintiles of by wage, so
right. But if you had specific industries where you said, I think these people are low wage workers in this very hyper specific industry, that could be disaggregated, but I'll have to see if there's another way to do what you're asking. I don't think that there is, but I will look into it.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Adon, and then I'm not sure if Christina S has another comment to make. No, okay. Adon, and I thought I saw Alex's hand, but his hand may have gone down. But Adon, go ahead.
Sure, really quick, a comment and then some questions. I think to Christian, I was actually looking last night at some of the comptrollers' recent reports, and I think there's one from January 2022 that talks about food services and accommodation. And I did so. I looked it up because it stuck out to me that I think the wages in that sector specifically were down, I want to say maybe 40%. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. And they were hit pretty much the hardest. And what I wanted to see was, in terms of the comptroller's data, low to medium income neighborhoods having the highest percentage of folks that wind up working as fast food servers, cooks, et cetera. And unsurprisingly, a lot of the data came from neighborhoods that were predominantly Black and brown and would be affected presumably by presumably affected by the decision we might be making in terms of increases. The question that I had in terms of, so the HVS report, generally, because as you know, this is my first time on the board, are we expecting that data to come in June prior to any final vote? And is there any indication that might not be the case?
No, I definitely expect it before the vote. I'm not sure of the exact date, but in order to extend the rent stabilization law, the vacancy rates have to be reported to the New York City Council.
Great.
And I'm not sure of the exact date of that, but I think that date is sometime in May or June. I will have some data probably in the next couple of weeks. I might not have the vacancy rates then, but some of the data regarding income and rents will probably be available within the next 2 weeks, hopefully before the preliminary vote. I just asked for that last night, actually, if I could get that before the preliminary vote.
Understood. Thanks. And also the NLIHC report, the national report, which I guess was not released yet. Do we have any additional information about that or no?
I mean, I do the exact same thing that they do in that report. I did.
Okay,
It's like literally exactly the same. So
thank you.
Any more questions for Danielle or comments on the Income and Affordability Study? Okay. All right, I will now introduce our Research Director, Brian Hoberman, who will present additional income and expense data.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Can everyone see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to do a brief presentation of a memo that follows up on our income and expense study. RGB staff requested and analyzed supplemental data from the Department of Finance for the same RPI period that was reported in the 2022 study, INE study, grouping buildings that contain rent stabilized units into several categories, which are not mutually exclusive as they overlap each other. The categories are all buildings that contain at least one rent stabilized unit, buildings that contain at least 20% stabilized units, 50% or more stabilized, 80% or more stabilized, 90% or more stabilized, and 100% stabilized buildings where all the residential units are stabilized. And we also break it down by location as well. Table 1 illustrates the proportion of buildings containing at least one stabilized unit in each category, broken down by location. There is a notable difference between Core Manhattan and the rest of the city. Buildings that are entirely rent stabilized, 100% stabilized, comprise 44% of buildings containing at least one stabilized unit in the city outside of Core Manhattan, while just 8% fall into that category, Core Manhattan. This is the figures in the right-hand column. Looking further at the proportion of buildings that are 100% rent stabilized, the proportions from lowest to highest are 31% in Upper Manhattan, 37% in Queens, 47% in Brooklyn, 55% in the Bronx, and 56% on Staten Island. Though note that there are only 85 buildings that contain at least one rent stabilized unit on Staten Island. Table 2 in the memo, which is too detailed to present in a slide, breaks down average rent, income, costs, and NOI in 2020 per unit per month by location and proportion of stabilized units. When looking at NOI around the city, there are small differences between all stabilized buildings containing at least one stabilized unit and 100% stabilized buildings. In Core Manhattan, 100% stabilized buildings NOI is $4 less than all stabilized buildings that contain at least one stabilized unit, while in the city outside of Core Manhattan, 100% stabilized buildings NOI is $24 less than all buildings containing at least one stabilized unit. In Table 3, which looks at the cost-to-income ratios for all buildings that contain at least one stabilized unit, in unaudited data, which is the bottom section of the table, there is a 2.0 percentage point difference between Core Manhattan at 68.6% and the rest of the city, 66.6%. That's on the left-hand column. However, among buildings with 100% stabilized units, the right-hand column, the proportions reverse and the difference shrinks to 1.1 percentage points at 65.5% in Core Manhattan and 66.6% in the rest of the city. This suggests that building cost-income ratios may be more dependent on the proportion of stabilized units in a building rather than where a building is located, if it's in Core Manhattan or elsewhere in the city. In addition, in Core Manhattan, the cost-income ratios among 80%, 90%, and 100% stabilized are all lower than Core Manhattan's all buildings, 20% and 50% or more stabilized categories. Further, in the city excluding Core Manhattan, the cost-income ratio for 100% stabilized buildings is identical to the cost-income ratio for all stabilized buildings. Table 4 in the memo, which is also too detailed to show on a slide, breaks down average longitudinal rent, income, costs, and NOI changes from 2019 to 2020. by location and proportion of a building containing at least one stabilized unit. Looking at the changes in NOI, there was minimal variation based on the proportion of stabilized units within areas. For example, there was only a 1.1 percentage point difference in the change in NOI in core Manhattan between all stabilized buildings and 100% stabilized buildings. In the city, excluding core Manhattan, there was a 0.6 percentage point difference between all buildings, all stabilized buildings, and 100% stabilized buildings. And in the final table, table 5, the proportion of distressed properties are broken down into 3 areas: citywide, core Manhattan, and the city excluding core Manhattan. The stress rates are all higher in core Manhattan compared to the rest of the city. For example, 9.3% of the buildings that are at least 20% stabilized are distressed in core Manhattan. That's 259 buildings. And buildings that are 100% stabilized have a distress rate of 13% in core Manhattan, equal to 41 buildings. Meanwhile, in the rest of the city, there is a minimal difference between the categories, with all distress rates falling between 5.3% and 5.5%. And that's my brief presentation of the memo. If anyone has any questions, I will take them. Thanks.
Christina S.
Brian, thank you. Does that data include 421A recipients?
It includes every building with at least one stabilized unit. So yes, it does.
Okay. Yeah, 421A is, I mean, I don't know how much we need to go into it, but 421A is starting from a very different standpoint than your 100-year-old typical rent-regulated building in terms of upkeep, maintenance. 421A is by definition new construction. It's just a perspective point.
Alex?
Hi there. So I actually have a similar question as Christina and one other question. This is really interesting information and it follows up on the previous discussion about why Manhattan has such a sharper change or decrease in NOI compared to the other boroughs. And last time we talked about, market rate, a lot of these buildings have market rate units as well as regulated units. So there may have been a sharper decrease in market rate rents. There may have been more vacancy. This data is sort of ambiguous about that. And it raised a question in my mind about does Manhattan have a lot more of these newer rent regulated units that were under 421A or other programs where they were basically market rent, but then put in rent stabilization so that the rents are much higher and maybe susceptible for bigger decreases during COVID than older rent regulated units. So I guess my question is if it's possible to see what percentage of these newer rent regulated units are in Manhattan compared to the outer boroughs. Because I think that may be one of the reasons we're seeing such a big difference between Manhattan and the rest of the city in NOI. And my other question, which is sort of in the weeds, as if this first one wasn't, was when you look at the data from Manhattan, you see a sharp decrease in, you see that the NOI went down by 20.7% for units that were 20% or more stabilized, and then minus 15.5%. So there was a diminishment in the decrease of NOI. But when you look at core Manhattan, upper Manhattan, there's much less difference across the different categories. I don't really understand that. So in core Manhattan, it goes from 25.8% for 20% plus stabilized to 24.4%. And in upper Manhattan, it goes from 5% to 3.9%. So something peculiar that the data for Manhattan overall shows a bigger change across categories in NOI change compared to core Manhattan and upper Manhattan? So I know it's a really detailed question, but I think it's important to try to get a handle on why NOI is decreased so much more in Manhattan compared to the rest of the city. So questions.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I certainly think that Manhattan was hit hardest by rent decreases in market rate units, but also, retail and commercial space also was hit hard, which can also be a factor.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Actually, I think I can explain it. If I'm going to share my screen and bring up that table in the memo. So NOI is a result of, what's happening with rent, income, and cost. So if you look at something like core Manhattan, you see much larger decreases in rent and income. And your expenses declined, but they decline at a much lower amount than those areas of rent and income. So that's going to impact your NOI. So you're going to see bigger drops in NOI because of that. If you take a look at upper Manhattan, which is here, the decreases are similar between rent, income, and costs. So your NOI declines are going to be less. Bear in mind, income, costs and rent and income are starting with a bigger dollar figure, obviously. So you could say, oh, well, I see in upper Manhattan you had 5.3% decline in income, but you had the same decline in expense. Why isn't NOI the same? Well, simply because you're starting at a higher dollar amount. So you're still going to see a decline in NOI. So that's why you're seeing that. I can't point to specific reasons because the data is simply rent collected and income collected, actual expense data. So, but clearly in core Manhattan, they just collected a smaller proportion of the rent and income, which would include commercial, than they did in, say, upper Manhattan. So I hope that helps, Alex, to sort of explain those two drops.
I'm actually looking, when you look at the Manhattan overall figures on the second panel on the top.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. No, so I guess my question was that for Manhattan overall, you see a big drop from 20.7% decrease for the least regulated unit buildings, or 20% more regulated, to 15.5%. So there's a big drop off, or I don't know what you want to call it, but the level of NOI, the decrease was much less. You see that big difference here. And then when you look at core Manhattan, you don't see that kind of abrupt change across the categories. And that's what I was sort of puzzling about. You see what I'm talking about?
What abrupt change in the declines in income?
Yeah, so the decline in NOI. So it goes from 20.7% for 20% plus stabilized to minus 15% to 13%. Pretty big changes across categories here. And then when you look at core Manhattan, the magnitude of the change is high,
right,
but there's not that much difference across categories. That's what I was trying to, again, this is really in the weeds.
In terms of core and upper, if I could just add, in terms of the number of buildings or the proportion of buildings that fall into those categories varies. So if you go to table 1, for example, 100% stabilized in core Manhattan is only 8% of the buildings, while in upper Manhattan it's 31%. Similarly, if you go to 50% stabilized, it's 29% in core and 81% in upper. So you're going to have many more buildings in upper Manhattan that fall into these categories than in core Manhattan. So that you can't, that's why it's sort of tough to compare the two parts of Manhattan.
I see. Okay.
Can I weigh in on the first part of your question? If you don't mind 2017 data, I can get you the ages, the year built of buildings in Manhattan. I don't have access to the 2021 HVS data yet, but if you don't mind it from 2017, I can get that for you pretty quickly.
Thank you.
Rob?
Thank you. So just in hearing the report, I'm just curious why the board doesn't factor in debt service to the NOI calculations as an additional data point. If you are just using some math, Mike Mendel last week from M&T pointed out, use like a number of 30% debt service. So if you use that as a standard on top of the unaudited cost to income ratio, you get like 97% or even higher of the monthly income going to costs. I mean, in essence, it's like, debt service is akin to like paying for a car, talking about the cost of owning a car, but excluding the monthly payment, because this is an integral part of owning a building is unless you're owning it at cash outright, there's debt service. It needs to be factored in.
Well, we don't have any source for debt service, and we also don't factor in building appreciation. So I think those are impossible to incorporate to any of our reports.
I would think that what Mike has added, yes, debt service is something that always you have to consider when we talk about NOI, because it's not simply profit. NOI is not profit. It's net operating income. And I believe that 30% was not just debt service from what Mike had said. It also, I believe, included taxes, but he didn't specify if it included real estate tax or just income tax paid by the owner. I'm not sure. We have to clarify that with Michael.
Rob, this is an issue that has come up, for all the years that I've been on the board. It's a totally good issue, but as Brian said, we don't have a data source that speaks to that. If any of the people coming for the owners on next week spoke to that, that would be very useful, I think for the board to hear, to kind of look at a real pro forma that takes into account not just expenses, but also debt service would be very interesting. No one's really presented that in any kind of comprehensive way since I've been on the board.
No, it makes sense. I got it. Thank you.
Christina S.
So another question, are major capital expenditures included in the data, meaning a new boiler, a new roof, new windows? It used to be owners had a mechanism through an MCI at the DHCR, but the HSTPA all but rid owners' ability to recoup some of those major capital improvements in the form of modest rent increases by the number of rooms in the stabilized units. So I'm just wondering if any major capital improvements are included in the data.
Major capital improvements are not included, though I don't think, individual apartment improvements I know were limited, but I'm not sure if MCIs were limited in the same way. I think they may have been spread out over more months for collection though.
The percentage of the MCI that can be collectible was hampered by HSTPA. I can get you the exact amendment from HSTPA that impacted an owner's ability to recoup on an MCI.
Christina, and I'm going to ask Andrew to confirm what I'm going to say is true, but to answer your specific question, I don't believe that MCIs are contained within the maintenance and operation costs. So any expenditures on MCI would come out of that piece of the revenues that exceeds the NOI, just like debt service.
Correct.
Arpit and then Adnan.
Yeah, I just had a follow-up on Robert's question. So the census I know has the rental housing finance survey. And this does, I believe, ask a national sample of landlords about various expenses, including, I believe, their mortgage expenses. I don't know if there's a large enough sample for, to look at New York specifically, or maybe there's a composite of large metropolitan areas that might provide a benchmark for what debt service cost might be, but maybe this is something that research staff could look into.
I've looked at that data in the past. I think it's just, the sample, I think is too small for New York City and probably even for the region, but it's worth looking into.
Yeah, we've done that with different data sources, and we find the same thing. It's just a sample for New York. It never seems to be large enough, and I think it operates. New York is a unique animal in a lot of ways when it comes to rental housing. So I don't know, comparing debt service to others metropolitan areas, I'm not sure it's something, unless we have a good sample size that we're confident in reporting.
Don?
No, I was just going to respond just really quickly about the MCI. It was a change in the percentage and in the lifetime of the MCI rather than being in perpetuity. And those increases were way higher pre-2019. And it's a shame that we also don't have a lot of HCR data about, the number of deregulated units, both legally and illegally, as well as MCI challenges that were successful for owners who were at times double dipping with some of the alleged repairs that were being made to take such increases.
Don, I'm not responding directly, but HCR will answer some questions that we have based on the data that they have access to. It touches on some of those things, like how many MCI applications there were made for how many dollars. And so it doesn't speak to everything that you said, but we'll get some information from HCR when they come in May.
Okay. Do you happen to know off the top of your head, and if not, we can save it for May, but in terms of like the number of PARs of challenges to those applications, as well as like the success rates of any of that, do we have that information? Do we know that should be coming or no?
Let me defer to Andrew on that. I don't remember.
They don't break it out to the reasons why, but they give the total amount applied for with MCIs and the total amount accepted. So the amount, which is always lower. So the amount not accepted could simply be it doesn't qualify, or it could have been challenged. It would be both in that category, but I don't believe we break it out which part of that number. But it says this is what owners asked for, this is what was approved. Okay. So it sort of gets to that, but not specific.
Thanks.
Any more questions for Brian or comments about the data he presented on the different, the rent regulated percentage rent regulated data? Okay. All right, so let me turn it back to Danielle, who will now present the 2022 hotel report.
Okay, thank you. I just need to share my screen again. Okay, we're seeing the presentation, right?
Yes.
Thank you. The New York City Rent Guidelines Board is charged with setting annual rent adjustments for rent stabilized units in Class A and Class B hotels, rooming and lodging houses, and single room occupancy buildings, all referred to generally as hotels. The board has historically used information from RGB's research reports, including the Price Index of Operating Costs and the Housing Supply Report, to determine appropriate hotel guidelines. Periodic memos beginning in 2007 and related to rent levels in rent stabilized hotel units have also supplemented these reports. The inaugural 2022 hotel report will, for the first time, consolidate research related to rent stabilized hotels into a single report. The report includes information on certifications of no harassment for SROs, illegal hotel violations, and the number of hotel units registered with New York State Homes and Community Renewal, HCR, as well as the average and median rents in these units. Data from the hotel portion of the PIOC is also included. In summary, there were 63 certifications of no harassment issued by the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development for SROs during 2021, an increase of 85.3% over the prior year. The Mayor's Office of Special Enforcement issued 2,760 violations for illegal hotels in 2021, an increase of 80.7% from the prior year. The 2022 PIOC found an average decrease in the cost of operating hotels of 1.3% between April of 2021 and March of 2022. As based on an analysis of 2020 and 2021 Hcr registration data, the median legal rent for hotels and rooming houses is $864, and the average is $1,066. The median rent received for rooming houses and hotels is $800, and the average is $908. As based on a longitudinal analysis of 2020 and 2021 Hcr registration data, the median legal rent fell 0.3% between 2020 and 2021, and the average legal rent rose 0.4%. The median rent received fell 0.2%, and the average rent received rose 0.6%. SRO owners may convert their housing to other uses after obtaining a certification of no harassment from the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. After falling by 69.6% in 2020 to 34, the number of CONHs granted by HPD rose in 2021 by 85.3% to a total of 63. This graph illustrates the number of certifications of no harassment granted by HPD for SROs from 2016 through 2021. Certifications ranged from a high of 135 in 2016 to a low of 34 in 2020. As previously noted, certifications rose by 85.3% in 2020 to 63. A series of laws beginning in May of 2011 strengthened the city's ability to crack down on housing being used illegally for transient occupancy and increase the fines for doing so. In 2021, 2,760 violations were issued by the Mayor's Office of Special Enforcement for the illegal rental of units for short-term use, including apartments, hostels, and SROs, an increase of 80.7% from 2020. The majority of violations, 1,507 or 54.6%, were for dwelling units in Manhattan, with 716 violations in Brooklyn, 25.9% of the total, 472 violations in Queens, 17.1% of the total, 59 violations in the Bronx, 2.1% of the total, and 6 in Staten Island, 0.2% of the total. Between May of 2011 and December of 2021, approximately 23,000 violations have been issued by this agency as part of its efforts to address illegal short-term rentals. This table summarizes, by borough, the violations issued by the Mayor's Office of Special Enforcement in each year between 2016 and 2021. As you can see, the majority of violations in each of these years are in Manhattan, while the Bronx and Staten Island have the fewest number of violations. As noted on the last slide, the number of violations rose 80.7% in 2021 from 1,527 to 2,760. This slide presents data from the hotel portion of the 2022 Price Index of Operating Costs. Per the 2022 PIOC, the hotel price index for all hotels that contain rent-stabilized units decreased 1.3% this year, a 3.2 percentage point decline from the 1.9% rise in 2021. There were increases in all of the hotel PIOC components except taxes, which fell 14.0% and account for 42% of the entire hotel index. The fuel component increased, rising 15.0%, and accounts for 13% of the index. Insurance costs rose by the second greatest proportion, 10.9%, and account for 6% of the index. The remaining four components all rose by lesser proportions, including maintenance, which rose 7.6%, utilities, 7.0%, labor costs, 3.6%, and administrative costs, 2.7%. Among the different categories of hotels, the index for traditional hotels decreased by 6.0%, while rooming houses increased by 4.6%, and SROs increased by 3.6%. Since 2007, periodic memos produced by the Rent Guidelines Board staff have analyzed registration data filed with New York State Homes and Community Renewal, HCR, by owners of buildings containing rent-stabilized hotel units. Prior to 2017, staff relied on the registration information provided by the owner or managing agent to identify hotels and rooming houses. However, a close analysis of the data showed that there were registration errors, and many apartment buildings were being erroneously registered as hotels or rooming houses. Since 2017, staff have analyzed the individual records of buildings registered with HCR as either hotels or rooming houses to try to determine if they fit the legal definition of a unit that would be regulated under the RGB hotel orders. While not necessarily a complete count of rooming houses and hotels, the methodology that is used to identify hotels is more representative than would be based solely on owner-reported HCR registration status. Using the methodology developed in 2017, the sample frame for the 2020-2021 HCR analysis included 107 hotels and 350 rooming houses, a total of 457 buildings. However, many of these buildings do not register each year. In 2020-2021, 312 of the 457 buildings in the sample frame were registered with HCR. Because 2021 filings are not complete as of the publication of this report, the buildings in the sample frame were also searched for in 2020 data. However, data from 2021 was utilized for the vast majority of these buildings, 87, while 94% of the data used to compute median and average rent levels was based on 2021 HCR registration filings. Owners of buildings containing rent-stabilized units are required to register annually with HCR with detailed information about the buildings they own and the units within them as of April 1st of each year. Among the information that HCR requests is the unit status, which can be recorded as either rent-stabilized, vacant, permanently exempt, or temporarily exempt. For those units that are registered as exempt, owners can also provide additional information about the reason. In total, 10,188 hotel and rooming house units in 312 buildings were registered in the latest data. Of these units, almost half, 5,037, were registered as rent stabilized. For the 3,750 of overall units that were registered as temporarily exempt, the most common reason cited is hotel or SRO transient. An additional 1,401 units were registered as either vacant or permanently exempt. The HCR registration data can also be used to determine how many buildings, as opposed to units, are being used primarily for permanently rent-stabilized housing. As based solely on HCR registration data for the total of 312 hotels and rooming houses identified for the 2022 report, 48 of these buildings consist entirely of exempt or vacant units and have no rent-stabilized tenants, while 119 of these buildings have a proportion of permanently rent-stabilized tenants of at least 85%. Within the 119 buildings that are at least 85% occupied by rent-stabilized tenants, there are 3,445 units, 3,244 of which are currently registered as rent-stabilized. Note that solely for buildings registering as hotels, staff researches alternate sources of total unit counts. The number of buildings that are at least 85% occupied by permanently rent-stabilized tenants drops when utilizing estimated unit counts for hotels as derived from sources outside of HCR registration data. Based on these estimated unit counts, a total of 89 buildings are at least 85% occupied by rent-stabilized tenants. These 89 buildings contain 2,902 units of housing, 2,719 of which are rent stabilized. This slide will present a quick explanation of the types of rents that can be registered with HCR. Owners can register up to 3 different types of rents with HCR during the annual registration filing as of April 1st of each year. All rent stabilized units have a legal rent. Under current law, this is the amount of rent that can be charged to new tenants upon a vacancy or to current tenants who do not have a registered preferential rent. A preferential rent is defined as a rent that owners charge to tenants that is lower than the registered legal rent. Among the reasons owners utilize preferential rents are market conditions at either the time of the initial lease or the subsequent renewal lease, or agreements with governmental agencies subsidizing the rent of the unit. Under current law, future rent increases are based on preferential rents until vacancy, at which time the owner may collect up to but not more than the legal rent. Actual rents are the rents that are paid out of pocket by subsidized tenants, with the balance being paid by government programs such as Section 8, Shelter Plus, or SRE. The RGB uses the HCR registration data to calculate a 4th type of rent, rent received. This is an estimate of the rent actually being received by the owner, generally speaking the legal rent, unless a preferential rent has been recorded. Each of these types of rent provide an important source of information. The legal rent can inform on the maximum amount able to be collected by owners either currently or upon vacancy. Preferential rents can inform on the prevalence of a less competitive market or regulatory agreements. Actual rents can provide a more accurate representation of rent burden, where low-income tenants may have rents that are subsidized, and the rent received is the best estimate of the revenue owners are currently receiving for each unit. This slide will present median rent levels from 2020-2021 for each of the 4 types of rent we just discussed. Per HCR registrations from 2020-2021, the median legal rent for rent stabilized units is $864 for both hotels and rooming houses combined, a total of 4,852 units. In total, 1,106 units, or 23% of the total, also report preferential rents, with a median preferential rent for both hotels and rooming houses combined of $1,031. In total, 1,607 units, or 33% of the total, also report actual rents, with a median actual rent for both hotels and rooming houses combined of $257. And the median rent received by owners for rent stabilized units is $800 for both hotels and rooming houses combined. This slide will present the same types of rents as the last, but focusing on averages instead of medians. Per HCR registrations from 2020-2021, the average legal rent for rent stabilized units is $1,066 for both hotels and rooming houses combined. In total, the average preferential rent for both hotels and rooming houses combined is $1,006. In total, the average actual rent for both hotels and rooming houses combined is $469. And the average rent received by owners for rent stabilized units is $908 for both hotels and rooming houses combined. HCR registration data from 2020 and 2021 can also be analyzed longitudinally, comparing rent levels in the same set of units in each of the 2 years. Of the 271 hotels and rooming houses identified in just the 2021 data, 255 were also registered in 2020. However, not every building contains units with registered rents. Therefore, the longitudinal sample includes 55 hotels containing 1,645 rent stabilized units and 156 rooming houses containing 2,675 rent stabilized units. The longitudinal data for median rents shows that between 2020 and 2021, the median legal rent fell 0.3% overall. The median preferential rent was unchanged overall. The median actual rent rose 1.2% overall. And for the rent received by owners, the median fell 0.2% overall. The longitudinal data for average rents shows that between 2020 and 2021, the average legal rent rose 0.4% overall. The average preferential rent rose 0.4% overall. I'm sorry, fell 0.4% overall. The average preferential rent rose 5.2% overall. And for the rent received by owners, the average rent rose 0.6% overall. As can be seen on the previous slide, for some categories of rents, the median and average rents increased over the past year. An examination of individual records in a longitudinal sample shows that some owners increased legal rents, even though rent increases for hotels and rooming houses were not granted by the RGB during this time frame. In total, 79% of the units in the longitudinal sample had no increase in legal rent, while 4% of units had a rent decrease and 17% had a rent increase. The data shows that among the 727 units registering a legal rent increase, the majority increased rent by either 1.0%, 1.5%, or 2.5%. These increases coincide with 1- and 2-year lease increases granted to rent stabilized apartments under either order number 51 or order number 52. Each of these orders overlap with the timeframes in the Hcr registration data, which records rents at the static point of April 1st in each year. It is not possible to determine if the increases were taken illegally or if the unit is registered incorrectly. Thank you, and if you have any questions.
Questions on the hotel report? Alex.
Yeah, thank you. Quick question. So the actual rent, that's like the out-of-pocket rent in the case of people that have some kind of subsidy. So it's the tenant contribution when government or some other party might pay the rest of the rent.
Yeah, if the unit is being registered correctly and accurately by the owner who's submitting the registration, then the definition you provided would be exactly right. Some owners might not understand the difference between a preferential and an actual rent. And they put the preferential rent in there, or there is an actual rent and they're not recording it. But for the most part, the definition you just gave is accurate.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Danielle about the hotel report? Okay, thank you, Danielle. Thanks, Brian. All right, let's just move on. So we have a little bit of unfinished business, which is ongoing from our last meeting, just about scheduling. So I wanted to give everyone an update. As I had mentioned previously, scheduling is particularly tough this year. The open meetings law was amended this month, and we're still waiting for final guidance from the law department as to how it affects our schedule. Members also have very tight schedules this year, and it limits the days that we can meet over the coming months. We're also facing some challenges with booking venues, as those venues deal with their own sets of challenges relating to in-person events. And we actually have had 2 board members recently dealing with COVID personally, and with a recent uptick in cases in New York City more generally, I'm prone to caution on this. So as a result, I've decided that we'll remain virtual through June 10th, which is allowed by law. And then we will schedule 2 in-person hearings the week of June 13th, and we will have the final vote in person on June 21st or 22nd. And I will provide a further update at our meeting next week as Andrew and I work out all the details about dates and venues. But I just wanted to give you that kind of interim update. And any comments or questions on scheduling? Okay.
sorry.
Yeah, Adon, go ahead.
So just so I heard you correctly, in terms of the week of June 13th, there'll be the 2 in-person meetings. How many in total is it going to be, or is it just those 2?
Just those 2. Because of board member schedules, we have this incredibly tight time period when we can do it.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
David,
Yeah.
do you anticipate the in-person hearings, do you anticipate them being during the day or in the evening, or one of each, or?
I think what we've tried to do and seemed to work the last couple of years was to kind of have a staggered, like a 4 o'clock start and a 6 o'clock start to catch people at different points in their childcare or work schedules. And that seemed to be well received. So I think we would do something like that.
Okay, that's fine. Just trying to figure out if I need to like take time off work.
Yeah. Not just the members of the public, but the members of the board have to balance those things too. And we'll get more details. I'm not going to promise next week, but we'll try to get finalized. It's going to be to some extent based on venues, and we're trying to find, venues that will accept the broadest swath of identification forms of identification and vaccines, and just to make it as accessible as possible. But every venue has their own restrictions in that regard, so we're just trying to figure that out. Okay, that's it for my unfinished business. Any new business from or any new topics from members of the board? All right, so we will reconvene for our very long day next Tuesday. That's our next meeting. We'll hear from tenant and owner organizations and advocates from both sides, and we'll give you an update then. So I guess now I'll remember for once to ask for a motion to adjourn.
Well, before
I'm
you do
sorry.
that, let me.
I can't even get that.
No, David,
Go ahead.
you are absolutely on point, and I truly appreciate that. That's awesome. Just to explain the day a little bit next week, so there will be a full day of a meeting, but it's broken up into 2 sessions. So the board will meet in the morning, starting at 9:45 to 12:15. You can, for the people who are watching, it's the same channel, YouTube channel that you can watch on. That's fine. A call-in number will be specific to that time period. And then we, as a board, will get a break of 45 minutes. So we will shut the meeting down, reconvene, starting, it'll be a different invite, and we'll be starting up at 1 o'clock. So in essence, even though it's a meeting that lasts the whole day, there'll be 2 different sections or time periods to it. And so just for the folks calling in, there would be just 2 different meeting IDs that will be posted on our website today. So just to bear that in mind, if you are public and planning on watching, it's just simply going to our YouTube channel like you do at any meeting for both the morning session and the afternoon session. But the board members will get a break of that 45 minutes, and then we'll reconvene. And we may be able to take, David, some periodic breaks of like 5 minutes or so in, between folks and stuff on the session, so people have an opportunity to have like a 5-minute break before, we'll see how it goes, but how board members are doing, but that's a possibility as well.
Okay, great. So motion to adjourn. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Rob got in quickly, and do I have a second?
I'll second.
Christian second. So I will see you all on Tuesday. Looking forward to it.